Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision.
Right, like a clear-cut answer.
Exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, well, there it is.
It's totally binary. It's broken or it's not broken. You can physically point right to the fracture.
Yeah, we really like things to be visible like that. But then you step into the world of global finance and, currency dominance.
And suddenly that x-ray machine is just completely useless.
It really is. We are looking at an economic landscape that is incredibly murky. You look for the thing that makes a piece of paper or, digital number on a screen actually valuable.
And you just can't point to a jagged white line.
No, you can't put it under a microscope.
Because the value simply isn't in the material itself. It resides entirely in the invisible threads connecting all of us.
It really is the absolute definition of financial muddy waters.
Yeah, because you're trying to quantify human behavior and international trust, which is really hard to measure.
Which brings us directly to our mission for you today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We have a massive stack of sources to get through today.
We really do. It's quite a trove.
We're looking at a comprehensive history of the Federal Reserve, internal FDS notes, dropping some really specific data from 2025 on international currency usage.
Plus a whole series of incredibly detailed public comment letters.
Right, regarding the future of digital money, and several pivotal speeches from Fed governors.
And synthesizing all of this material really reveals a core theme that we need to just keep coming back to.
Which is what?
That money is not merely a medium of exchange. It basically operates as an architecture of trust.
An architecture of trust. I like that.
Yeah, we are going to see the physical nature of the U.S. dollar change drastically throughout this discussion. I mean, from gold bars to linen and cotton blends to completely decentralized digital ledgers.
But the geopolitical and economic forces propping up that architecture and the modern forces threatening to, dismantle it.
Right. Those are the actual mechanisms we need to understand.
Exactly. So we are going to map the complete, definitive life cycle of the United States dollar.
From its very beginnings.
We'll trace it from its physical origins tied to gold, unpack the exact plumbing of how it basically conquered the global economy.
And explore the hidden frictions and taxes embedded in its current infrastructure.
Before decoding its wild digital future. But to understand the future of the dollar, we first have to understand the specific mechanics of how it became the center of the financial universe.
So we need to go back in time a bit.
Right. Let's go back to 1934. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is trying to pull the United States out of the Great Depression, and he executes the gold program.
Which was a massive, unprecedented shift. He essentially severed the domestic link between the U.S. dollar and gold.
Wait, severed it completely?
Domestically, yes. To understand why this was necessary, you have to look at the economic environment of the time.
The Great Depression.
Exactly. The country was in a severe deflationary spiral. People were hoarding gold because, well, they just didn't trust the banks at all.
Which makes sense. Banks were failing everywhere.
Right. But when everyone hoards gold, the money supply shrinks. Prices collapse, and businesses fail even faster.
So like a doom loop.
A total doom loop. So FDR actually made the private ownership of monetary gold illegal.
That still blows my mind. The government just said, you can't own gold anymore.
Yep. Citizens had to turn their gold into the Federal Reserve at a set price of $20.67 an ounce.
And once the government had collected all that gold, they immediately changed the math, didn't they?
They absolutely did. They repriced gold to $35 an ounce.
So just by waving a pen, they instantly increased the value of the Treasury's gold holdings.
Exactly. Which allowed them to aggressively expand the money supply and pump dollars back into the dying economy.
But this is where the system sort of split into two completely different realities.
Right. A bifurcated system was born right then.
How did that work?
Well, for the average American citizen, the dollar was no longer convertible. If you walked into a local bank and asked for gold in exchange for your paper dollars, they'd turn you away.
You probably get laughed at.
Or arrested. But for foreign governments and foreign central banks, the convertibility remained fully intact.
Oh, wow. So they got a different set of rules.
Completely. They could still demand American gold for their dollars at that newly minted rate of $35 an ounce.
So the dollar was completely unbacked fiat for, like, the guy buying bread in New York.
Right.
But it remained this rock-solid claim on physical metal for the Bank of England or the Bank of France.
Exactly. And that dual reality set the foundation for really the most important financial summit in modern history, which happened a decade later in 1944.
Bretton Woods.
Bretton Woods.
Okay, so paint the picture for us. World War II is still raging in Europe and the Pacific,
Okay.
but the outcome is becoming pretty clear. The Allies are going to win.
Yeah, the writing is on the wall.
So delegates from 44 nations gather at this hotel in New Hampshire to design the post-war global economy.
And they frame it as this grand compromise, a collaborative effort.
But looking at the actual balance of power, it seems like the United States just dictated the terms, right?
Oh, absolutely. The leverage the U.S. brought to that table was just unprecedented.
Because Europe was bankrupt.
More than bankrupt, they were financially devastated. To fund the war effort, European nations had to purchase massive amounts of weapons, supplies, food, everything from the United States.
And how are they paying for all that?
By shipping their national gold reserves straight across the Atlantic.
Oh, man. So America just drained Europe of its gold.
Pretty much. By the time the delegates sat down at Bretton Woods, the United States possessed the vast majority of the world's official monetary gold.
Which meant they held all the cards. That allowed the U.S. to design an entirely new architecture.
And they built it entirely around themselves.
I like to visualize Bretton Woods as this massive maritime anchor system. Like, imagine a huge fleet of ships.
Okay, I can picture that.
The United States is holding the heaviest part, the massive vaults of physical gold. That is the anchor resting firmly on the seafloor at $35 an ounce.
Right, providing the stability.
Oh, exactly. The U.S. dollar is the heavy, unbreakable chain leading up to the surface.
And the other nations.
All the other 44 nations, they're the boats. But they don't tie their ropes to the gold anchor. They tie their ropes directly to the dollar chain.
That is a perfect analogy, because practically they pegged their domestic exchange rates to the U.S. dollar.
So they didn't peg to gold at all.
No, they pegged to the dollar, which was pegged to gold. But the mechanics of this are so crucial to understand. A peg is not just a promise.
Right, you can't just say we're pegged and walk away.
Exactly. It requires active, daily maintenance. Say the British pound was pegged to the dollar, and the value of the pound started to drop on the open market.
The Bank of England can't just ignore that.
No, they had to step in. They had to use their own reserves of U.S. dollars to buy up British pounds.
To artificially decrease the supply of pounds.
Right, to push the price back up to the agreed-upon peg.
So they were forced to hold massive stockpiles of U.S. dollars just to keep their own currency stable.
Yes, and that stability was the entire point of the Bretton Woods system.
Because before that, it was a mess.
Complete chaos. After the 1930s, with hyperinflation, competitive currency devaluations, the total collapse of international trade, every merchant and manufacturer in the world needed predictability.
So like a French importer needed to know exactly what an American tractor was going to cost 6 months from now.
Exactly. And Bretton Woods provided that certainty by forcing everyone to coordinate around the dollar.
Which sounds great on paper, but it didn't last.
Well, it worked brilliantly for post-war reconstruction, but the system contained a fatal structural flaw.
The 𝗏𝗏 dilemma.
Yes, the 𝗏𝗏 dilemma. As global trade expanded rapidly in the 50s and 60s, the world needed more and more U.S. dollars to conduct that trade and maintain their pegs.
So the U.S. had to pump those dollars out.
Exactly. The United States had to run constant deficits, just pushing dollars out into the global economy.
Which, to be fair, they were pretty happy to do. The U.S. was spending heavily during this period anyway.
Very heavily.
We had the escalation of the Vietnam War, the massive domestic spending of the Great Society programs, the printing presses were running hot.
And that's where the fatal flaw becomes obvious when you just look at the math.
The gold wasn't growing.
Right. The global supply of U.S. dollars was growing exponentially, but the physical supply of gold sitting in American vaults was relatively static.
So foreign central banks started doing the calculations.
And they realized there was a huge problem.
They looked at the mountain of paper dollars they were holding, compared it to the physical gold backing it up, and realized the math didn't work.
It didn't. The United States could not possibly honor all of those claims if everyone asked for their gold at once.
It was essentially a slow-motion bank run on a sovereign nation.
That is exactly what it was. Countries began redeeming their dollars for physical metal.
Didn't France literally send ships?
Yes, France sent naval ships across the Atlantic to physically transport their gold bullion from the Federal Reserve vaults in New York back to Paris.
That is wild. The anchor was dragging.
The bleeding of U.S. gold reserves reached a critical threshold, and that leads directly to the events of August 1971.
The Nixon shock.
Right. President Richard Nixon realized that if he allowed foreign central banks to keep draining the gold, the United States would eventually be left with absolutely nothing.
So he goes on national television,
Yeah.
and he announces that he has directed the Secretary of the Treasury to temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold.
Notice the word temporarily.
Right. But he fundamentally cuts the chain connecting the dollar to the anchor, and the anchor just drops away into the abyss.
It was a unilateral default on the core promise of Bretton Woods. Nixon officially ended the commodity money era right then and there.
And birthed the modern unconvertible fiat currency system.
Yep.
From that Sunday night forward, the U.S. dollar was backed by absolutely nothing other than the decree of the American government and the productivity of the American economy.
I always get stuck on this exact moment in history, because logic suggests the entire system should have just imploded.
It certainly felt like it would.
When Nixon cuts that rope, why didn't all the other boats just float away? The United States fundamentally altered the deal. They removed the only thing giving the paper intrinsic value.
Right, so why didn't they dump it?
Exactly. Why didn't foreign governments immediately dump their U.S. dollars, declare the paper worthless, and find a new standard to peg to?
Looking at the underlying mechanics of what happened between 1944 and 1971 really answers that puzzle.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Over those almost 3 decades, a profound network effect had taken root. We mentioned earlier that foreign central banks had to hold dollars to maintain their pegs.
Right, they had stockpiles of them. Because they held all those dollars, international commodity markets began pricing their goods in dollars to make trade easier. Global supply chains wrote their long-term contracts in dollars.
So they spent 30 years building an entire global infrastructure using one specific set of blueprints.
Exactly. You don't just burn down the building because the architect changed the name of his firm.
Okay, that makes sense. It was just too deeply ingrained.
The concept of structural inertia took over. If a foreign central bank decided in 1972 to dump all of its U.S. dollars in protest, what specific asset were they going to buy to replace them?
There wasn't anything big enough.
Exactly. They couldn't buy the Japanese yen or the German mark in the quantities they needed. Those financial markets simply weren't deep enough or liquid enough to absorb billions of dollars in capital.
If they tried, they'd just break those smaller economies.
They'd cause massive domestic inflation in Japan or Germany.
Furthermore, a massive parallel banking system had developed outside the control of the United States entirely, right? The euro-dollar market.
Oh, the euro-dollar market is the hidden engine of the dollar's survival.
How did that even start?
It goes back to the Cold War. The Soviet Union held a lot of U.S. dollars from their oil exports. But they were terrified of keeping those dollars in American banks where the U.S. government could just freeze them.
Because of the political tension.
Right. So they deposited their U.S. dollars in banks in London instead.
Wait, so a euro-dollar is just a regular U.S. dollar?
It's just a regular U.S. dollar sitting in a bank account outside the jurisdiction of the Federal Reserve. That's all it is.
And that created a whole new market.
It did. Those London banks realized they had massive deposits of U.S. dollars sitting there, and they started lending them out to other international corporations.
So suddenly you had a thriving global lending and borrowing market denominated in dollars, completely disconnected from the gold standard.
And operating entirely beyond American borders.
So by the time Nixon closed the gold window, the global economy was just thoroughly addicted to the dollar's liquidity.
The world was trapped by the convenience of the network.
Trapped. But the United States reaped an incredible benefit from that trap, because severing the gold constraint permanently unleashed the Federal Reserve.
Yes, it fundamentally changed central banking.
Because when you're forced to defend a gold peg, your monetary policy is dictated by the physical amount of metal you hold.
You're handcuffed to the gold.
Exactly.
Right.
But once the peg is gone, the central bank gains the supreme power to actively manage the economy.
They can manipulate interest rates, expand the money supply to fight off recessions, or contract it to fight inflation.
The transition from a domestic commodity currency to a globally entrenched fiat currency was complete.
Surviving the chaos of the 1970s was basically the ultimate test of that structural inertia.
And that brings us to the present day. Because the dollar didn't just survive the 1970s, it mutated into this unstoppable force.
It really did.
The FED notes from 2025 provided in our sources detail the sheer scale of the dollar's current dominance.
And the numbers are staggering.
The numbers describe an architecture of supremacy that requires us to really examine the three fundamental dimensions of money.
Store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account.
So let's break those down. What's the distinction here?
The distinction is that while most domestic currencies only fulfill these three roles within their own borders, the U.S. dollar fulfills them for the entire planet.
It's the global default. Let's analyze store of value first. This metric looks at where sovereign nations actually park their national wealth.
Right. So when a country runs a trade surplus, they accumulate foreign capital.
Basically, their profits.
Yes. And they place those funds into their official foreign exchange reserves.
The 2024 data shows that the U.S. dollar accounts for roughly 58 to 60% of all disclosed official foreign reserves globally.
That's a massive share, though putting that into historical context, that figure actually represents a decline.
Oh, really? What was it before?
The dollar peaked at roughly 71% of global reserves back in the year 2000.
Wow, over 70%.
Yeah, so nations have engaged in a slow, deliberate diversification over the last 2 decades. But we have to look at the alternatives to understand the dollar's enduring grip.
Who's in second place?
The euro, which is the second most utilized currency, but it sits at a really distant 20%.
So even after a decline, the dollar is still lapping the closest competitor by a factor of 3.
Exactly. But we need to explain how these reserves actually work mechanically.
Right, because foreign governments aren't loading up cargo planes with pallets of $100 bills and locking them in underground bunkers.
Definitely not. Holding physical cash generates zero yield and loses value to inflation every single year.
So what are they actually holding?
When we say foreign nations hold dollar reserves, what we actually mean is they hold U.S. Treasury securities.
Ah, government debt.
Yes. They take their surplus capital and purchase American government debt. A treasury bond is essentially an IOU from the United States government.
And it pays interest.
It pays a guaranteed interest rate and is universally considered one of the safest financial assets on the planet.
Because the U.S. government is never defaulted on its debt.
Precisely. By hoarding these treasuries, foreign nations are actively lending trillions of dollars to the United States.
That perfectly covers the store of value. The U.S. government just operates as the world's ultimate savings account.
That's a great way to put it.
So let's move to the second dimension, the medium of exchange. This is the daily plumbing of international commerce.
Right, the actual buying and selling.
When companies operating in 2 different countries decide to do business, they have to mutually agree on a currency to write the contract in.
And the trade invoicing data illustrates the absolute dominance of the dollar in facilitating that global commerce.
The numbers in the report were crazy. In the Americas, 96% of all international trade invoicing is denominated in U.S. dollars.
96%. Almost everything.
In the Asia-Pacific region, that number is 74%. And in the rest of the world, excluding Europe, it stands at 79%.
It's just overwhelming.
Let's walk through the mechanics of why that is. Say a company in Brazil is selling soybeans to a buyer in Mexico. Why would they choose to price that contract in U.S. dollars rather than the Brazilian real or the Mexican peso?
Especially since neither company is located in the United States.
Exactly. The soybeans never touch U.S. soil.
The answer lies in the concept of the FX triangle, or the bid-ask spread of foreign exchange markets.
Okay, unpack the FX triangle for us.
If the Mexican company wants to pay in pesos, the Brazilian company has to convert those pesos into reals.
Makes sense.
But because the direct trade volume between the Mexican peso and the Brazilian real is relatively low globally, banks charge a massive premium to execute that specific exchange.
Because the market isn't deep.
Right. The intermediary bank, taking on the risk of holding both pesos right before the trade and reals right after, demands a hefty fee for their trouble. It's a highly illiquid market pair.
So the fees just eat up the profit.
Exactly. So due to those exorbitant transaction costs, it is mathematically cheaper to execute 2 separate trades using the dollar as a bridge.
Even though it's an extra step.
Even though it's an extra step. The Mexican company converts their pesos into U.S. dollars. The market for peso-to-dollar exchanges is incredibly deep and liquid, so the fee is negligible.
Ah, I see.
Then, the Brazilian company receives the dollars and converts them into reals. Again, the dollar-to-real market is vast and cheap.
So using the dollar as the intermediate step minimizes the total transaction friction.
It does.
It's the financial equivalent of using English as a bridge language between 2 rare dialects at a global conference.
That's a perfect analogy.
You don't try to find a translator who speaks both rare dialects perfectly. You just have both speakers translate their thoughts into English.
And this mechanical reality drives the third dimension, unit of account.
Right. The unit of account metric shows that approximately 50% of the entire global gross domestic product belongs to countries that anchor their domestic currencies to the US dollar.
Half of the world's GDP.
Some use a hard, explicit peg, completely surrendering their monetary policy. Others use a soft, implicit peg,
where their central bank actively intervenes in the markets to ensure their currency value stays within a narrow band relative to the dollar.
But the result is the same. Half of the global economy is effectively shadowing the moves of the Federal Reserve.
They have no choice. If the Fed raises interest rates to cool down the American economy, a central bank in a country pegged to the dollar must also raise their interest rates,
regardless of whether their own domestic economy needs cooling down or not.
Exactly. They import American monetary policy.
Okay, compiling all three of these dimensions, store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account, the Fed created an index of international currency usage.
And the data from early 2025 assigns the United States a dominant score of 64.9%.
With the euro trailing significantly at 23.9%.
But here is the massive mismatch in the data that we really need to unpack.
Right, the China question.
Exactly. China's currency, the renminbi or yuan, scores a microscopic 3.1% on that index.
I was reading Governor Waller's speeches on this, and the disconnect between their economic size and their financial influence is staggering.
It really is an anomaly.
China accounts for nearly 16.8% of global GDP. Their economy is larger than the entire Eurozone combined.
And the United States accounts for roughly 26% of global GDP.
So how can a country representing a quarter of the world's economic output, the U.S., command nearly 2/3 of the global financial plumbing, while the second largest economy is practically a rounding error?
It's a great question. Governor Waller addresses this paradox directly. He explains that economic size is a prerequisite for currency dominance, but it is not the deciding factor.
So just building more stuff doesn't equal financial dominance?
No. To achieve that 64% global usage, a nation must possess structural characteristics that cannot be synthesized overnight by building more factories or exporting more goods.
What's holding China back then?
The primary disqualifier for China is their strict use of capital controls.
Let's define the mechanics of a capital control, because the U.S. doesn't really have these, right?
Right. The United States operates with open capital markets. A foreign investor can pour $10 billion into American stocks, real estate, or bonds on a Monday.
And then what if they want it back?
They can liquidate those assets and move the $10 billion back to their home country on a Friday. The U.S. government does not restrict the outflow of capital.
But China operates under a fundamentally different philosophy.
Completely different. The Chinese government strictly regulates how much money can cross their borders.
So if you bring foreign capital into China, you cannot easily extract it without navigating this labyrinth of regulatory approvals.
Exactly. I've heard it described as a roach motel for capital.
A roach motel, that's hilarious. The money checks in, but it cannot check out.
Right. And if you are a sovereign wealth fund managing the retirement savings of an entire nation, you are not going to park hundreds of billions of dollars in a financial system where the government might suddenly lock the exit doors.
You require absolute liquidity. You need to know you can get your money out.
Which brings us to the second structural advantage of the United States. We discussed the U.S. Treasury market earlier.
Right, the massive IOUs.
The sheer depth of the American bond market is unmatched. When global panics occur, institutional investors need to move gargantuan sums of money into safe assets instantaneously.
And the U.S. can handle that volume.
The U.S. Treasury market can absorb a $50 billion trade without causing significant price fluctuations. No other sovereign debt market has the capacity to absorb that level of capital flight.
Okay, so that's open capital flows and deep markets. What's the third factor Waller highlights?
It actually goes beyond finance entirely and steps into governance. It is the intangible infrastructure of strong property rights and the rule of law.
Meaning how the legal system works.
Yes. When a foreign entity purchases a U.S. asset, their investment is protected by a centuries-old legal tradition.
They rely on the independence of the American judicial system to enforce contracts fairly.
Even against the U.S. government itself. Trust is not decreed by a central authority. It is accumulated through decades of consistent, predictable legal precedents.
Whereas an autocratic system where regulations can be altered retroactively by executive fiat inherently repels long-term capital preservation.
Precisely. This combination, open capital flows, infinitely deep treasury markets, and an independent judiciary creates the ultimate safe haven.
So during times of global crisis, capital doesn't flee the dollar, it rushes toward it.
The fortress is incredibly well fortified.
But reading through the public comments submitted to the Fed, particularly the ones focused on digital transformation, a totally different narrative emerges.
Yeah, the tone shifts drastically.
The fortress is structurally sound, but the internal plumbing moving the water through the fortress is basically rusting away.
The dominance of the dollar has resulted in a legacy infrastructure that is deeply inefficient.
So let's pivot to the frictions, the embedded taxes, and the geopolitical pressures threatening the system.
Starting with the physical cash itself.
Right. The physical representation of the dollar is failing. According to the Federal Reserve's own data, the velocity of physical cash is just plummeting.
It's true. A paper bill printed on a cotton and linen blend is used, on average, less than 5 times domestically before it is retired.
Less than 5 times. Cash is essentially obsolete for modern commercial logistics.
And as physical cash usage declines, commerce is forced onto digital rails.
But the current digital rails aren't some public utility operated by the government.
No, they are a patchwork of proprietary profit-seeking networks operated by commercial banks, clearinghouses, and payment processors.
Which introduces severe mechanical frictions. We really have to unpack the mechanics of correspondent banking to understand why the public comments are so angry.
It's a complicated system.
Like, if a business in Kenya wants to pay a supplier in Peru, they can't simply hand them digital cash. The money must travel through this convoluted chain of intermediaries.
Because the bank in Kenya does not have a direct relationship with the bank in Peru. So the Kenyan bank must use the SWIFT system to send a secure message to a larger correspondent bank in London.
And SWIFT, it's important to note, doesn't actually move money.
Exactly. It's simply a highly secure messaging platform, kind of like WhatsApp for banks, instructing them to update their ledgers.
Okay, so the London bank receives the message, debits the account of the Kenyan bank, and credits an account holding dollars.
Then the London bank sends another SWIFT message to a correspondent bank in New York.
The New York bank updates its ledger and finally sends a message to the local bank in Lima, Peru, to credit the supplier.
This whole process requires multiple banks to hold Nostro and Vostro accounts with one another.
What are those exactly?
They are pre-funded accounts sitting idle just to facilitate these transfers. And at every single node in this chain, the bank takes a fractional cut of the transaction for assuming the settlement risk and performing compliance checks.
It is exactly like a bucket brigade trying to put out a fire.
Yep.
The bucket of water is passed from the Kenyan bank to the London bank to the New York bank to the Peruvian bank. And at every handoff, a little bit of water sloshes out of the bucket.
Those are the fees.
And it takes days for the bucket to reach the end of the line.
It's so slow. The public comment submitted by the organization 𝗧𝗍𝗍 really quantifies the sheer scale of this friction.
What did they find?
𝗧𝗍𝗍 analyzed the global financial services market and found that by 2021, it had grown to $22.5 trillion in revenue.
Just in revenue for the middlemen?
Right. And when you compare that astronomical figure to the total global gross domestic product of roughly 84 to 94 trillion, it reveals a massive hidden burden on the global economy.
It translates to a 2.2% global tax on all economic activity.
Every single transaction is affected.
The entire world is sacrificing over 2% of its total output just to compensate the middlemen operating this bucket brigade.
𝗧𝗍𝗍 uses a brilliant analogy in their letter. They compare the current correspondent banking system to forcing internet users to affix physical postage stamps on their emails.
Oh man, that is so true. We have the technology to move data at the speed of light, yet we force financial data through toll booths designed in the 1970s.
And the burden of that 2.2% tax doesn't fall evenly.
No, I imagine the big players negotiate better rates.
Exactly. A massive multinational corporation negotiating billions in transfers can demand lower fees.
So who gets stuck with the bill?
The true weight falls on developing nations, small businesses engaging in cross-border trade, and immigrant workers sending remittances back to their home countries.
The high cost of accessing the dollar network creates a massive economic incentive for the developing world to seek out alternatives.
But the technological friction is pushing people away, right? The geopolitical friction might be even more aggressive.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because the U.S. government has increasingly weaponized the reliance on the dollar system.
The sources specifically highlight the financial sanctions imposed following the 2022 Russian-Ukrainian war.
Right. The United States, in coordination with its allies, utilized the choke points of the dollar network to effectively excommunicate the Russian economy.
And we need to explain the mechanics of those sanctions, because they didn't send soldiers to seize physical assets.
No, they manipulated the ledgers.
Exactly. They blocked major Russian financial institutions from accessing the SWIFT messaging network.
And without SWIFT, Russian banks couldn't communicate with foreign correspondent banks to verify transactions.
Furthermore, the U.S. and its allies froze hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian sovereign reserves.
Which, as we discussed earlier, were largely held in digital treasury securities or in accounts at Western central banks.
Right. The U.S. simply ordered those institutions to refuse any withdrawal or transfer requests.
So the assets were completely immobilized by a keystroke.
Just a keystroke. And the immediate impact on Russia was devastating.
But the secondary impact on the rest of the world was arguably more profound.
Everyone was watching.
Every other nation not perfectly aligned with Washington's foreign policy watched the U.S. weaponize the financial plumbing.
And they realized that their accumulated wealth, their treasury reserves, and their ability to import essential commodities were entirely dependent on the continuous political goodwill of the United States.
That realization triggers a powerful drive toward geoeconomic fragmentation. Nations actively seeking to insulate themselves from the blast radius of potential future sanctions.
The source documents cite multiple instances of countries negotiating bilateral trade agreements to settle commodity purchases like oil and agricultural products in alternative currencies.
We see trade settling in Chinese yuan, Indian rupees, and even decentralized cryptocurrencies.
Entirely bypassing the U.S. dollar and the correspondent banking system.
So when you stack these vulnerabilities together, the 2.2% global middleman tax, the days-long settlement delays, the explicit weaponization of the SWIFT network.
Not to mention domestic concerns like Moody's downgrading the U.S. credit rating due to massive fiscal deficits.
The fortress begins to look a little precarious.
It really does.
It begs the question, if the dollar's infrastructure is acting like a rent-extracting monopoly, and highly motivated sovereign actors are actively building bypass routes to escape sanctions, are we simply documenting the inevitable slow-motion collapse of American financial hegemony?
The narrative of the dollar's imminent demise is incredibly popular right now. But a rigorous analysis of the underlying macroeconomic forces suggests a much more resilient reality.
Okay, lay out the counterargument.
While the incentives to bypass the dollar are stronger than ever, the structural trap we identified in the 1970s has only grown deeper. We must look at a concept popularized by former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke.
The global saving glut.
Yes. The global saving glut is the counterforce to the geopolitical panic.
How exactly does this mechanism operate?
Consider the macroeconomic structure of massive export-driven economies like China, Germany, or the oil-producing nations of the Middle East.
Okay, they sell a lot of stuff.
Right. They produce far more than they consume domestically, resulting in enormous trade surpluses. They accumulate hundreds of billions of dollars in profit every year.
Let's use a tangible example to ground this. Say a manufacturing hub in Shenzhen exports millions of smartphones to the United States.
The American retailers pay for those phones in U.S. dollars.
So the Chinese factory owners receive those dollars. But they can't use dollars to pay their factory workers or pay their local taxes. They need Chinese yuan.
Exactly. So the factory owners take those billions of dollars to the People's Bank of China and exchange them for yuan.
And now the Chinese central bank is sitting on a mountain of U.S. dollars.
A massive mountain. Now, if they simply sold those dollars on the open foreign exchange market, the massive supply of dollars would drive down the value of the dollar and drive up the value of the yuan.
Basic supply and demand. But a strong yuan makes Chinese exports more expensive and less competitive globally.
Which undermines their entire economic model. They need cheap exports.
To prevent their currency from appreciating, the Chinese central bank must absorb those dollars and invest them abroad.
And because of the sheer volume of capital involved, the only market deep enough, safe enough, and open enough to absorb that massive influx of savings without collapsing is the U.S. Treasury market.
So they're structurally forced to buy American debt just to keep their own currency artificially suppressed and their export engine running.
It's a completely codependent loop. The world produces an excess of savings, and the United States acts as the global consumer of last resort, supplying the financial assets, the treasury bonds, to absorb those savings.
So foreign nations literally fund the massive U.S. government deficit because they have nowhere else to safely park their sovereign wealth.
To truly abandon the dollar system, another nation would have to step up and replicate this exact dynamic.
Which means they would have to run massive, perpetual trade deficits to pump their currency into the global market.
And they would have to completely open their capital markets to allow foreign nations to buy their sovereign debt without restrictions.
And neither Europe nor China is currently willing or structurally capable of playing that role.
Right. The Eurozone does not issue a unified, European-wide sovereign bond equivalent to a U.S. Treasury, fragmenting their debt market.
And China's capital controls make the yuan a complete non-starter for major reserve accumulation.
So the world complains about the dollar's monopoly, but they remain utterly dependent on the liquidity it provides.
Wow. The threat of a foreign fiat currency replacing the dollar is mathematically improbable in the near term.
It really is.
But what if the threat isn't the yuan or the euro? What if the threat is the underlying technology itself?
Now we're getting to the exciting part.
If the correspondent banking system is the bucket brigade, someone is eventually going to invent a high-pressure fire hose.
And that transitions us into the final and most fiercely debated section of our deep dive, the digital frontier.
The Federal Reserve and the broader financial ecosystem are actively wrestling with how the dollar must evolve to survive the digital transition.
And the source documents present a fascinating ideological battle between a public, government-led path and a private, decentralized path.
So let's examine the public path first, the development of a U.S. central bank digital currency, or CBDC.
We need to define exactly how a CBDC fundamentally differs from the digital money people already use on their banking apps every day.
Right, because my bank app feels digital enough.
When you log into your Chase or Bank of America app and see a digital balance of $1,000, you do not actually hold U.S. dollars.
I don't. What do I hold?
You hold an IOU from a private commercial bank. It is a commercial bank liability. You are trusting that the bank is solvent and your risk is mitigated by government deposit insurance.
Oh, I see. A CBDC operates on an entirely different legal foundation.
Yes. A retail CBDC would be a direct liability of the Federal Reserve itself made accessible to the general public.
So it would be the exact digital equivalent of holding a physical $20 bill in your wallet.
Exactly. If a commercial bank goes bankrupt, your CBDC balance is entirely unaffected because the money lives on the central bank's ledger, not the private bank's ledger.
Several public comments urge the Federal Reserve to aggressively pursue a CBDC just to maintain global competitiveness.
Because over 100 nations, including major geopolitical rivals like China, are currently piloting or deploying their own central bank digital currencies.
The fear is that if foreign CBDCs offer instantaneous, nearly free cross-border settlement, the 2.2% tax of the U.S. dollar system will drive global commerce to adopt foreign digital rails simply for the efficiency.
And a commenter named 𝗏𝗏 submitted a highly technical argument focusing on the physical limitations of this kind of digital money.
Right. He argues that a U.S. CBDC must incorporate offline functionality to truly replicate the utility of physical cash.
Which is a huge point. Think about it. If a hurricane knocks out the power grid and cellular towers across Florida, traditional digital payments fail completely.
People cannot buy groceries or gasoline. They're totally stuck.
Physical cash is the ultimate resilient network because it settles peer-to-peer without requiring a third-party verifier.
So 𝗏𝗏 argues that a poorly designed CBDC that requires constant internet connectivity introduces a massive systemic vulnerability.
Instead, he suggests cryptographic solutions utilizing secure hardware enclaves on mobile devices.
Which could allow digital dollars to be transferred offline, syncing with the master ledger only when connectivity is restored.
And solving that offline capability could also radically accelerate financial inclusion.
Because another commenter emphasized that millions of unbanked citizens or undocumented residents lacking the requisite paperwork to open a commercial bank account are currently locked out of the digital economy.
A Fed-issued digital wallet would democratize access to basic financial plumbing, entirely bypassing the minimum balance fees and overdraft penalties levied by private banking monopolies.
So the technological benefits of a frictionless, inclusive digital dollar are clear.
Very clear. However, implementing a retail CBDC triggers a massive, potentially catastrophic macroeconomic risk.
Commercial bank disintermediation.
Yes, the banking panic risk.
Let's break that down. Because if the Federal Reserve releases a perfectly secure, completely free digital wallet app that allows me to hold digital dollars directly with the U.S. government.
Why would you ever keep your checking account at a commercial bank?
I wouldn't. I would transfer all my funds straight to the Fed.
And that exact scenario terrifies the traditional financial sector.
Because commercial banks operate on fractional reserve banking.
Right. They take in your deposits and lend those funds out as mortgages, auto loans, and business lines of credit. They only keep a fraction of the actual cash in the vault.
So if the public en masse moves their deposits from private banks to the Fed's CBDC ledger, the commercial banks lose their fundamental funding source.
The banks would be drained of capital. They would be forced to halt all lending.
Small businesses couldn't get loans to expand. Individuals couldn't get mortgages. The credit markets would just freeze, potentially triggering a severe recession.
It's a huge risk. To prevent this panic, many policymakers have suggested intentionally crippling the CBDC.
Crippling it? How?
They propose placing strict limits on how many digital dollars an individual can hold, or enforcing negative interest rates on CBDC wallets.
Purely to incentivize people to keep their money in the riskier, fee-heavy private banking sector. That seems entirely counterproductive. You're inventing a superior technology and then breaking it on purpose just to protect the legacy middleman.
Stephen Williamson, a chair in central banking, submitted a scathing critique of that exact approach.
What did he say?
He argues that central banks should not intentionally kneecap a CBDC just to protect the commercial banking sector. If the central bank can provide a superior, safer digital payment mechanism, they have an obligation to offer it.
But how does he address the risk of all the deposits fleeing the private banks during a financial crisis?
Williamson points out that the Federal Reserve already possesses the standard policy tools to manage liquidity crises.
Like what?
If a panic occurs and depositors move billions of dollars from Chase Bank into their Fed CBDC wallets, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet expands massively.
Right. The Fed suddenly has all the money.
And the Fed can simply take those incoming funds and lend them right back to Chase Bank through the discount window or other lending facilities.
Oh, so the central bank just acts as the intermediary.
Yes. Recycling the liquidity back into the solvent but illiquid private banks, preventing the credit freeze without degrading the quality of the currency itself.
Okay, the debate over how to safely implement a public CBDC is incredibly complex. But while the government committees debate the risks of disintermediation, the private sector has been aggressively building their own architecture.
And this is honestly the most unexpected pivot in our entire stack of sources.
We are looking at the explosion of private stablecoins.
The data surrounding this development completely reframes the narrative of digital disruption.
For years, the popular narrative has been that cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, Ethereum, decentralized finance, was an existential threat to the U.S. dollar.
Right. The cypherpunks were going to build a decentralized utopia that made sovereign fiat currencies obsolete.
But a speech by Fed Governor 𝗵𝗵𝗶 highlights a statistic that forces a complete reevaluation of that premise.
It really is a bombshell stat. According to the data, 99.6% of the transaction volume within the decentralized finance ecosystem relies on stablecoins that are pegged exactly 1-to-1 to the United States dollar.
Wait, almost 100%.
99.6.
So the revolutionaries set out to destroy the fiat system, and they ended up building the fastest, most efficient rail network for the greenback in human history.
That's exactly what happened. The mechanics of how a stablecoin maintains that peg are critical to understanding why this entrenches the dollar's dominance.
Let's look at a major player like USDC, referenced in the public comment submitted by PayPal.
Okay, so a private company issues a digital token on a public blockchain like Ethereum. To convince the market that the token is worth exactly $1, they must fully back it with real-world collateral.
So if a user sends the company one actual US dollar, the company mints one digital USDC token and sends it to the user's crypto wallet.
And the company takes the physical dollar and deposits it into a reserve account.
But how do they ensure the token retains its value on secondary trading markets?
The system relies on arbitrage. If the price of a USDC token drops to 99 cents on a crypto exchange, algorithmic traders instantly buy up millions of the discounted tokens.
Because they know it's worth $1.
Exactly. They take them back to the issuing company and redeem them for the underlying $1 of collateral, instantly pocketing a 1-cent profit per token.
And this constant arbitrage pressure guarantees the token rarely deviates from the peg.
And here is the macroeconomic masterstroke. The company issuing the stablecoin doesn't just leave billions of dollars in a zero-interest checking account.
Right, they want to make money on it. They invest the collateral.
And what is the only asset safe enough and liquid enough to serve as the reserve backing for hundreds of billions of dollars in digital tokens?
Short-term U.S. Treasury bills.
Exactly. As the demand for digital dollars on the blockchain explodes, the companies issuing these stablecoins are forced to purchase massive quantities of U.S. government debt to collateralize the tokens.
PayPal's comment notes that USDC alone had facilitated over $4.3 trillion in on-chain transfers.
Trillions of dollars moving globally, settling in seconds.
Entirely bypassing the 𝗏𝗏 and 𝗏𝗏 bucket brigade of the correspondent banking system and avoiding that 2.2% global tax.
Governor Marin projects that stablecoin market capitalization could grow by $1 to $3 trillion over the next few years.
And every single dollar of that growth translates directly into new artificial demand for U.S. Treasury securities.
The private crypto market is essentially executing a massive decentralized global saving glut.
They are actively funding the United States government deficit by hoarding treasuries just to back their digital tokens.
This realization creates a massive philosophical tension for the Federal Reserve.
I really want to scrutinize the implications of this. If the Fed builds their own perfect retail CBDC, they assume the massive technological burden of maintaining a global digital ledger.
Plus, they take on all the cybersecurity risks, and they risk the political fallout of accidentally destroying the commercial banking sector.
Which is why Governor Waller explicitly stated that a U.S. CBDC appears to be a solution in search of a problem.
His hesitation makes total sense when you view the private sector as essentially an outsourced research and development division.
The Fed can essentially sit back and do nothing.
They allow private tech companies and decentralized crypto networks to spend billions of dollars iterating on blockchain technology,
solving the friction of cross-border payments and upgrading the rotary phone infrastructure into a smartphone ecosystem.
And because 99% of that ecosystem voluntarily pegs itself to the US dollar, the private sector is doing the geopolitical work of spreading the dollar to the digital frontier for free.
It is the ultimate Trojan horse.
It really is. The technology designed to disrupt the dollar has become the primary vehicle for entrenching its supremacy for another century.
The private market is solving the speed and cost issues that plague the legacy banking system, while simultaneously increasing the global demand for U.S. sovereign debt.
But this strategy requires a massive abdication of sovereign control.
Explain that.
If the future of the dollar's dominance relies entirely on private stablecoins managed by tech corporations and decentralized protocols, the U.S. dollar basically becomes a ghost in the machine.
The Federal Reserve still controls the base interest rate, but they lose visibility and direct regulatory control over the actual rails where the money moves.
And that tension between sovereign control and private innovation is going to be the defining economic conflict of the next decade.
The dollar survives, but the infrastructure becomes entirely privatized.
Exactly.
We have dissected an incredible amount of financial mechanics today. We started in the depths of the 1930s deflationary spiral, walking through the exact mechanics of FDR severing the domestic gold link to inflate the money supply.
We analyzed the Bretton Woods anchor system, detailing how foreign central banks were forced to intervene in markets to maintain their dollar pegs.
We broke down the mechanics of the euro-dollar market, explaining how structural inertia and offshore lending prevented the collapse of the fiat system when Nixon permanently severed the gold window.
We quantified the current dominance of the dollar across global reserves, utilizing the FX triangle to explain trade invoicing monopolies.
And analyzing how capital controls and the rule of law create an unmatched safe haven compared to, say, China.
We exposed the 2.2% global tax hidden within the bucket brigade of correspondent banking and detailed how the weaponization of the SWIFT messaging system incentivizes geopolitical fragmentation.
And finally, we unpacked the digital frontier, comparing the banking panic risks of a direct Fed liability CBDC against the mint and burn arbitrage mechanics of private stablecoins that use U.S. treasuries to back their blockchain ledgers.
Synthesizing this entire century of monetary evolution really brings us back to our opening premise. The physical form of the dollar is basically a distraction. The power of the U.S. dollar doesn't emanate from the gold once held in Fort Knox.
It doesn't emanate from the specific cotton blend of the paper bills.
It doesn't even emanate from the cryptographic hashing algorithms of the blockchain.
The ultimate foundation of this entire architecture is simply enduring trust.
Trust that the U.S. Treasury market will remain infinitely deep and liquid when a crisis hits.
Trust that the American judicial system will enforce property rights transparently.
And trust that the macroeconomic gravity of the global saving glut will continue to compel nations to seek shelter in American debt.
The mechanics of the system are essentially designed to enforce that trust.
Yes.
But that leaves us with one final profound implication to consider as we close this deep dive. Think back to that opening analogy of the X-ray.
Right. Looking for the fracture.
We find comfort in centralized authority. The doctor pointing to the fracture, or the Federal Reserve managing the ledger.
But if the future mechanics of U.S. dollar dominance are going to be maintained not by the government, but by decentralized private stablecoin algorithms running on permissionless blockchains.
Who actually wields the power in the global economies tomorrow? Does the power reside with the sovereign government that officially issues the fiat currency? Or does the ultimate authority quietly shift to the coders who architect the digital networks the money is forced to run on?
It is a question that completely challenges the fundamental definition of sovereign money.
Until next time, keep diving deep.